All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring some genuinely profound philosophical insights from the Mahaprajnaparamita Sastra, written by Nagarjuna. We're going to unpack exactly how this ancient text views the way our human minds construct reality. And honestly, it is packed with ancient wisdom that feels shockingly relevant to how we live our lives today. So let me ask you something kind of wild to start us off. Do you actually exist, or are you just a temporary collection of parts? I know, it sounds like a ridiculous question, right? Of course you exist, you're sitting right there. But Nagarjuna's philosophy asks us to completely strip away those basic assumptions. It challenges us to deeply question the fundamental reality of our own identity and really the entire physical world we interact with every single day. Well, to really get to the bottom of that question, we've got to look at our first core concept, aggregation. In the original text, this is called heipai. In plain language, aggregation is just the temporary coming together of various parts or conditions to form what seems like a unified whole. And the absolutely crucial word here is temporary. The text argues that literally everything we perceive as a single solid object is actually just a combination of smaller elements. Nothing out there has its own independent permanent existence. It only exists because its parts have momentarily teamed up. Let's break this down with a super relatable everyday example. Literally, the human body. Think about what actually makes up a human being. You've got a head, a neck, shoulders, a spine, legs, the whole shebang. When we look at someone on the street, our brain just immediately sees a person. But Nagarjuna points out that a person is really just this collection of physical components temporarily joined together. Think about it. If you take away the head, the neck, the spine, the legs, where exactly is the person hiding? The person isn't some separate, distinct thing. It's literally just the result of all these parts aggregating. We can see how this logic builds using another incredibly clear example from the text, fire. Consider the elements you need to make one. You've got to have heat, light, and fuel. When those specific conditions come together, boom, they create fire. And here's the kicker. If you remove the heat, and you remove the light, and you remove the fuel, is there some magical third independent entity called fire just hanging out by itself? Nope. The text argues that apart from its characteristics and its fuel, fire simply doesn't exist. It is merely the aggregation of those specific conditions. So this creates a bit of a practical problem for us, right? How are we supposed to talk about all these aggregations? That brings us to our second big concept, provisional naming or jaming. Because, let's be real, it would be totally exhausting to walk around saying, hey, watch out for that hot aggregation of heat, light, and fuel. So we just slap a convenient, fabricated label onto it. We call it fire. Provisional naming is an incredibly useful tool we use for communication and survival in the mundane world. But, and this is the massive philosophical twist of the text, we make the fatal mistake of believing that our convenient little labels actually represent a permanent inherent reality. Just to anchor this whole idea in Nagarjuna's ancient wisdom, listen to this really powerful recurring line directly from the source text. It exists through combination. It is spoken of only through worldly names. That right there is the entire philosophy distilled into a single sentence. The physical reality of things is just combination, aggregation, and the way our brains comprehend it is just through worldly names, provisional naming. The text repeatedly emphasizes that things don't actually arise and perish on their own. They only appear to do so because conditions combine and disperse, and we just happen to give those combinations names. This leads to a seriously fun intellectual challenge. If you take away the parts, where exactly does the name go? Say a wooden chariot is broken down into a pile of wheels, axles, and planks. The chariot is gone, sure, but where did the actual label chariot go? Did it fly away? Did it just vanish into thin air? The fact that you literally cannot find the label once the parts are separated proves the illusion of the label itself. The name never actually had any physical weight or reality to begin with. And the text makes this radical assertion about these provisional names. It says the name is not inside the object, it's not outside, and it's not in the middle. Nagarjuna uses a brilliant piece of logic to explain this. He says, look, if the name fire actually contained the reality of fire, then simply saying the word fire would literally burn your mouth. On the flip side, if the name was completely separate from the object, you could say the word fire and suddenly produce a puddle of water. Because neither of those ridiculous things happen, the text concludes that the label has no physical location or inherent existence whatsoever. It's a pure fabrication of the mind. Okay, so here is where we pivot to the absolute climax of this philosophy. If everyday objects like human bodies, chariots, and fires are just temporary aggregations with convenient labels slapped on them, what about sacred and holy concepts? I mean, it's relatively easy to accept that a chariot is just a label for pieces of wood, right? But the Mahaprajna Paramita Shastra doesn't just stop at everyday objects. It takes this exact same ruthless logic and applies it to the most revered, sacred concepts in Buddhist philosophy. Let's see what happens. Let's consider the physical body, form, alongside the mind, consciousness. Now compare that basic aggregation to the Bodhisattva, the ultimate enlightened being of compassion. The shocking conclusion from the text is that even an exquisitely adorned, perfectly enlightened bodhisattva is ultimately just a temporary combination of form and mind. If you take away the physical form and the consciousness, you are not going to find some magical, independent entity called a bodhisattva hiding underneath. Therefore, bodhisattva is, you guessed it, merely a provisional name. And they push the boundary even further. The text explicitly states that perfect wisdom itself, prajna paramita, the literal ultimate spiritual goal of this entire philosophy, is just a worldly name. It is just a label. Crazy, right? But the reasoning makes sense. If you believe that perfect wisdom is this tangible, solid thing you can grasp onto and achieve, you are still totally trapped by the illusion of provisional naming. True wisdom is realizing that even the concept of true wisdom is totally empty of inherent independent existence. This brings us to a really profound warning from the text regarding something called dharma attachment, or fa'ai. Dharma attachment is basically this dangerous trap of clinging to spiritual teachings, sacred concepts, or righteous labels as if they were permanently real things. The text gives a stunning analogy for this. It compares clinging to these sacred provisional names to a life-saving medicine turning into a deadly disease. Think about it. If you take medicine to cure an illness, but then you become completely addicted to the medicine, you're still sick. Clinging to the label of enlightenment actually prevents actual enlightenment. But here is the ultimate psychological payoff of this entire philosophy. When you truly, deeply realize that absolutely everything, from your own physical body to the absolute highest spiritual concepts, is just a temporary aggregation with a provisional label, what actually happens to you? Well, the text says the mind becomes not alarmed, not afraid, and not terrified. Why? Because fear inherently comes from the threat of losing something permanent. If you realize nothing was ever permanent to begin with, and it's all just this flowing dance of temporary conditions and convenient names, there's literally nothing left to be terrified of losing. Your mind is completely freed from anxiety and regret. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. What temporary labels in your own life are you currently clinging to as if they were permanent? Is it a job title, a relationship status, maybe a political identity, or just an idea of who you should be? Remember the fire, and remember the human body. They are just aggregations, held together by provisional names. If you can loosen your grip on those labels just a little bit, you might just find that profound fearlessness the text is talking about. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the labels and keep learning.